we move on from the discussion that we're having here in this in chapter 9. I really thought we were going to go through 9 and 10 a lot faster than this, but too many things to stop and observe. Keep in mind that we've hit these 3 different ceremonies in the Torah, in the Old Testament, in the law, and we're moving now into a description of why these things are presented here. And we'll, as you might imagine, have to make a few more detours into the Old Testament to get through all of this. So we got to verse 11. We got through verse 11 through 14 and hit a couple of the high points going through here. Let me just read back through this. But when Christ appeared as high priest of good things coming, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, neither through the blood of goats and calves, but through his own blood, did enter in once into the holy places, thus securing eternal redemption. And literally it says, we're replacing thus securing with himself found eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons and the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, through the eternal Spirit, offered himself without blemish to God, cleanse our conscience from dead works to serving the living God. So we left it with verse 14, and I took us to the next section to kind of introduce what we're going to be talking about today, so you could kind of get an idea of what you should be thinking about going into this. But I want to go through verse 14 a little bit more, just because that has implications to where we get to on the other side of verse 17. How much more will the blood of Christ, through the eternal Spirit, offered himself without blemish to God? We have the mention of all 3 members of what would later be defined as the Trinity here in this verse. Christ, the Spirit, and God the Father. Christ provides the blood, the Spirit provides the offering. The Spirit provides Christ with the power to do the offering, and then God himself is the one to which it is offered to. And then it cleanses our conscience, just like the ashes of the red heifer in the water cleanses death, the contamination of death from those going through that ceremony in the Old Testament. Our conscience is cleansed from death, the dead works, the dead things in our mind, in our conscience. And remember, that word conscience has and we talked about this a few weeks ago, has a duality to it. There's 2 things in your conscience: good choices, bad choices, good choices, bad choices. So that's why our conscience is cleansed from the bad choices, the dead stuff. So with that set up, we move on to here. Therefore, he, Christ, is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. For where a will is involved, the death of one who made it must be established, for a will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. First, we need to talk about this mediator. Therefore, he, Christ, is the mediator of a new covenant, the new covenant. What does a mediator do? In the context of this word in Greek, it has no negotiating power. So this mediator is a little bit different. There is the best way to understand what this word means and specifically what is meant here in Hebrews is to determine what the reference is to. What have we been talking about for weeks now? What have we been talking about in Hebrews all through here? We're not talking about this, but we're not talking about our time. We're not talking about the writer's time. What time are we talking about? All of these references go back to the giving of the law, the Old Testament law. So that is what's in focus here too. Christ is the mediator of a new covenant because there was a mediator of the old covenant. You have any idea who that mediator of the old covenant was? So think about it in these terms. Israel came out of Egypt. God brought Israel out of Egypt. You've got Israel and you've got God. So if you've got a mediator, that means you have two parties and a third entity who is doing the mediating in between. When God brought Israel out of Egypt, who was the go-between? Moses. Moses is who this mediator is. Christ is following in the same path that Moses was in the Old Testament. As an example, this is the best summary version of this. The Lord said to me, Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stubborn people. This is referring to when he was up on the mountain. But this is the review of that in Deuteronomy. The Lord said to me, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stubborn people. Let me alone, he tells Moses, that I may destroy them and blot out their name from under heaven. And I will make of you a nation mightier and greater than they. And then Moses says, I lay prostrate before the Lord as before, 40 days and 40 nights. I neither ate bread nor drank water because of all the sin that you, Israel, had committed when they created the calf, in doing what was evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger. For I was afraid of the anger and hot displeasure of the Lord that the Lord bore against you, so that he was ready to destroy you. But the Lord listened to me at that time also. That's the mediation. God wanted to destroy Israel. Moses mediated by praying and asking and begging God not to do that. And God didn't do it. Now there's the whole implication here of, did God change his mind? Did Moses change God's mind? We're not going to get into all that. But because that's 3 weeks there. We don't want to do that. But this is the example of what we're dealing with in Hebrews. And this was not the only time it happened. This was a pattern. Moses did this all the time. He would literally blackmail God because his argument was usually, now you've brought us out of Egypt and the whole world's looking, and if you do this now, it's going to look like that you aren't powerful enough to accomplish what you set out to do in the first place. That was always Moses' argument. And you could say it worked. That all becomes your perspective on how God is dealing with this situation. But that's the example that we're following in Hebrews. That's what the mediator that we're referring to in Hebrews does. So with this pattern, that's kind of how we need to take that's how we need to take it when we look at it here. He's the mediator. Jesus became the one in between us and God, that whatever service, whatever ministry that is, he is the one who everything goes through. Because God never spoke to Israel. God spoke to Moses. Moses spoke to Israel. The people would come to Moses. Moses would go to God. That's how we're supposed to read this. That's what this mediator, this kind of mediator, that's what he does. So Jesus is the mediator of the new covenant because there is an old covenant. And we've been dealing with how the old covenant fails The new covenant is permanent. And Christ is the mediator of that covenant for us to God, from God to us. So that's not too bad. These next two verses are a mess. And we will spend some time trying to address that. So I showed you this last week. Where a will is involved, the death of the one who made the will must be established. That's how wills work, right? For it takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. That's the English translation. The Greek is much more complex, and the problem is the Greek isn't specific about what it's talking about. Now, this is not specific even in English, but it's a lot more specific than the Greek actually is. The way we read this implies that somebody has to die for the will to take effect, and it has to be the person that made the will, otherwise it's not any good. So this is either saying, well, directly, if you take that directly, then God the Father had to die for the will to take effect. And because God is God, gods don't die, can't kill God, so the will can't come into effect if it's God. Well, so it must be something else, and at this point, nowhere in the book of Hebrews has the writer of the book of Hebrews said Jesus and God are the same thing, which for this to work, Jesus and God, if Jesus is the one who's dying to make the will come into effect, Jesus and God have to be exactly the same. It has to be Jesus as God. And so God does die, which is where the argument in the later periods about that the patripassionists were accused of, calling them God killers by having Jesus be God. That's where all that was bantied back and forth. So there's no good explanation of this. Everything that you use to explain it in those terms has a problem. If you make Jesus equal with God, this is what I'm saying. If you make this Jesus, and Jesus dies and the will takes effect, then you have made Jesus equal with God the Father, and Jesus did die, so God did die, but God can't die. So there's no good practical explanation taking it this way. Now, let me make this even worse. This word will and the one who made it are the same word form. They have the same word form basis. It's these two words, diathēkē and diathēmē. So diathēmē is the covenanter, the one who makes the will. And diathēkē is the will. Okay? So what this literally says is where a diathēkē is involved, a diathēmē has to die, but that's not what it says, actually. But before we get to all that, we've seen this word over and over and over again. Diathēkē has been in there several times. This word occurs in the New Testament 30 times and 14 times in the book of Hebrews. So almost half the times in the New Testament, it's in Hebrews. And we've already seen at least 2/3 of those. So we've seen this word over and over again. And yet, when have we talked about a will? We haven't. So when we get to verse 16, the word that we've been seeing is changed by the translators. They don't use the same word anymore. They change it to will. Just for these two verses. Because of the difficulty of explaining what it says here. That's why they changed the word. So the word New Testament is new diathēkē. The word is covenant. What this literally says, if you don't change the translation, is where a covenant is involved. The death of the covenanter must be established. But they changed it here because this was the only way they could explain what they thought maybe the writer of the book of Hebrews was trying to say. Where we end up with this is we have to go to the Old Testament to figure it out, just like we did with mediator. But just to give you another example of the use of this word, Jesus said, "This is my blood of the diathēkē." Now, what does that say in the King James Version? This is my blood of the New Testament. When they did the translation of the King James Version, they made this the New Testament, the New Covenant. Because at some point, and the reason it doesn't say that in the versions that we read these days, the ESV says covenant, which is poured out for many. It doesn't say the new covenant. That's because over time, the scribes decided that the word new needed to be in there to explain that it was not the old covenant, it's the new covenant. But that wasn't literally in the original version. So they've taken the new out of it now. Here is the same example that we have. Jesus is saying, "This is my blood of the covenant." And actually adding new to that does it some injustice, because the way Jesus is saying this is, I'm doing the same thing that was done in the Old Testament for that law. This is the offering for the law. This is the blood of the covenant, the actual covenant. Because we're talking about an old covenant and a new covenant, but really, when you're talking about God and the whole plan of God, there's only a covenant. His people are bound by his covenant. So we've got to take this a little bit further to get the full explanation of what's going on here. We've got a lot of words we use for a covenant. So we've seen will, covenant, and we've kind of thrown testamentary in there, which is what a will is legally called. So far, there are some other words. There are agreements, deeds, a deal. What are all of these things? There's one word we use legally for what all of this is. It's a contract. All of this, for us in the 21st century, kind of works better from a legal perspective, which is what all this is, if we think about it in terms of the contract. So God made a contract with Abraham. He made a contract with the Israelites through Moses. And we're talking about a new contract in Hebrews. And for the contract to take effect, things have to happen. Now, normally it's not somebody having to die. It is for a will, but normally simply having two parties sign a piece of paper makes a contract work too. So the pattern for the kind of will, the kind of covenant, the kind of contract that we're talking about has been established in the past. What we do is we make a contract. But there's another word that gets used with making a contract that is very revealing to what we're talking about. We don't really use it as much. I've heard it a lot, but we don't use it as frequently as making contracts these days. We use it a lot with the word deal, though. What do you do when you make a deal? What else can you call that? You can cut a contract. You cut a deal. Now, where did that come from? What does that mean? Nobody ever takes the contract and runs scissors through it. What does that mean? it goes to exactly what we're talking about here. So I'm going to go backwards again like I did the other week because it makes more sense this way. This is the first time it happens. On that day, the Lord made a covenant, a contract with Abraham, saying, to your offspring, I give this land from. Now, if you've ever seen a deed, and I'm sure you've all seen a deed, when you get to this point in the contract, what happens? There's this weird description of the property. From here to here, from here to here, from here to here, from here. Well, that's what happens here. That's the contract that God is making with Abraham. And how do they sign the contract? When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. This was a standing way of creating these contracts in this time. That there was this fire involved in the contract, and the way that it worked was you would create this pot and you would carry it between these pieces. Between these pieces of what? Verse 9, he had said to him, bring me a heifer 3 years old, and a female goat 3 years old, and a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brought him all these, cut them in half, laid each half over against the other, but he did not cut the birds in half. I guess they were too small. But you cut everything in half, you put one piece here, you put one piece here, and the fire goes down between them. So what did they do? What did God do here? He cut a contract. And this directly impacts what we're talking about in Hebrews, because these words get used in this way. Changing these words from covenant to will conveys to us an idea, which then gives us the license to go out and use that idea in any way we want to use it. But the interpreters, by changing the word, have done what they normally do. They've explained it to us, which gives us the license to say, well, this is obviously talking about Jesus dying and the will taking effect, which is very likely, nearly 100%, but very likely, not anywhere close to what the writer of the book of Hebrews meant, which will then leave us with a further question. So we'll take it from here next week.